a report on the Identity and Ideology workshop, and it will be presented by Samina Rahman. So we will begin now with Samina Rahman on identity and ideology.
The workshop on identity and ideology spent one whole morning on methodology because we felt, the participants felt, that it was very important for each of us, since we are moving in a sense from what is commonly perceived as the public sphere into what is normally perceived as a sort of identity, a more personal thing. However, I want to make it clear that although we did, and I think many made it clear before we did, although we divided into different groups, but each one of the groups and the discussions reflect what is happening in the other workshops, and they are meant to mesh together. So it isn't as if questions of development were not discussed in the identity and ideology workshop, or that literature was not discussed, or that all the other concerns of the other workshops were not brought in. But the morning, as I said, the first morning was spent on personal introductions. Now, it was felt that we couldn't go into our inner identity or the ideology that we all internalize unless we locate ourselves very firmly and locate our identity and see the ideological influences on the choices that we have made or those that we have not made. Now, this methodology is intrinsic to feminism itself. And as a result of it, the morning session was very rich, and we brought up troubled aspects and complexities in each introduction. Because the way that we introduced ourselves was that we tried to locate ourselves in our multiple identities, because it emerged from the discussion that every person there did not have one identity. They had an identity as a woman, they had an identity as a Pakistani, or they had perhaps an ethnic identity or a religious identity. So there was a whole range, very rich and varied range, which kept coming up in the introductions, which then was reflected in the more formal papers. So this was not only sensitive to the interplay and layers, but we have become very conscious of these identities, which then can be manipulated by brothers or fathers, going right up to the state itself. In the afternoon, we had paper presentations, and there was a diversity of issues and themes dealing with identity politics and ideologies at play. The first paper that was presented was actually looking at the psychological dimensions of identity. It talked about the parallels. It was a critique, actually, of the heroic, masculinist, rational discourse, which eliminates paradox, doubt, and humility, and is unable to deal with metaphor and ambiguity. This leads to a fragmentation of the self, because a lot of it was the Jungian analysis, really, of what constitutes the personality or the identity. And what was being argued in the paper, Gramsci presented the paper, what was being argued in the paper was that there is a fragmentation of the self because we have internalized the heroic myth. With all the monotheisms, the religious monotheisms that have developed, have internalized the heroic myth, and this has led to a division of the self, a fragmentation of the self, which she called, it articulates itself as a Cartesian split between the mind and the body. And therefore we tend to go for singular resolutions, and we tend to go for moral reductionism in masculine terms. Basically, it's saying that our thought structures are masculine. The way we analyze things is masculine because we are becoming very unidimensional in the way that we look at it. And this obsessive or unidimensional thought, she then actualized it by saying that this is the basis for fundamentalist discourse. This is the basis of the mullah. And at least it was Zurai's contention that this is also the basis on which the Pakistani intellectual, and she did a deconstruction of a letter from a local magazine, in which she says that the modern intellectual also looks at it. And both the mullah, that is the fundamentalist discourse, and the intellectual is actually misogynist, because it has a crude fear of the feminine, and it does not understand the complexity of the feminine mind. It does not understand the multiplicity of the feminine personality. The mirror images of each other, the mullah and the intellectual, and both are anti-feminist because their discourse its roots go back to the same tradition, and that is the Freudian tradition, the heroic tradition, the tradition of overreaching ambition, and so on. And what happens is that a racist a racist vocabulary develops from the ideas that we find in science, for example, and this was something that was also brought up in the development paper. This business of, is science emancipatory or is science oppressive? So science is oppressive because the dialogue of science is a masculine dialogue. And therefore, women's perspectives are not integrated into science. Her intention was that the ability to doubt is healthy. And in the feminist discourse, there is a lot of criticism and the ability to doubt. There is less emphasis on the so-called rational scientific mind. So this was basically a critique of the rational scientific mind and the masculine tendencies found in that. Then we had a paper which was really a throwing out of ideas. Rusana Kambar made a presentation where she is in the process of evolving a methodology, and she really threw it open for discussion. It was more in the form of a discussion rather than any kind of a positive, complete presentation. She's evolving a methodology to study the experience of the colonization of Latin America vis-a-vis Muslim Spanish slave women that were trafficked or exported there and who are absent in all historical accounts. If I'm not mistaken, I think this is looking at it in the 16th century texts. She's looking at it. What happened to these women who were brought into Latin America? And where can we trace their influences? And she is hoping to make it a wide study, hoping to look at architecture, hoping to look at arts, and in fact there was a very interesting discussion between her and Salima Hashmi on the effects of it on the artifacts and on the handicrafts and the architecture of the place. So she is looking at two things. She's looking at the influence of the stamp of women culturally, and then she's also wanting to explore what happened to these women who so-called disappeared. Because we never hear of them. We hear of the male slaves, we hear of the male people who went there, but we never hear of the women. So this is sort of erotic conquest of Central America. And what happened to them? How many became prostitutes? How did they maintain their identity? Basically what she was saying is that, under those circumstances, how do people maintain their identity through colonialism? Where do we find the signs of it? And she made some interesting observations that when she was in Latin America, she was quite astonished to see the hand of Fatima in many places, the silver hand of Fatima in many places. She's not necessarily making any linkages yet, but basically what she was saying is that women conserve and preserve, people preserve their identity even in the most extreme situations. But they are erased by history because history is a masculine process. History does not talk about these kinds of influences. So she's hoping to excavate history itself and rediscover these women and the influences of these women, the absence of these women in history. The next paper is also came from Amina Zulfikar, who is a research student, and she is really looking at Pakistan as an Islamic fundamental state and trying to determine women's relationship to the state. And again, she's in the process of evolving her questions and her methodology. So basically, I think that you can say that the identity workshop was very exploratory in nature, because it was no complete findings that were being communicated. It was a dialogue between the participants. It was really saying, I'm doing this piece of work. I want to rediscover women. I want to understand what methodologies to evolve so that we develop a whole range of feminist criticism, feminist art history, feminist, the whole range of intellectual exercise that we need to bring women back into the discourse. So she was basically looking at seeking for answers, wondering whether there were answers in Islam. One of her theses was the tensions that she's exploring is that Pakistan was created as a secular state. And then at what point in time did the fundamentalist discourse start? And is the solution to it going to be found within the Islamic discourse, or will she have to move outside the discourse to find answers? And as I said, that she is still exploring the whole thing. Then Sabah Khattak gave a presentation, and hers was looking at state theory from a feminist perspective. And she was arguing that the state, again, picking up some of the threads from earlier presentations, that the state is masculinist and gendered, and therefore the discourse that it produces is a gendered discourse. And this impacts on society and affects all the relationships. So this is played out in terms of the domestic and foreign sphere, foreign policy, in the evolving of our domestic policy as well as foreign policy. In the domestic or private sphere, the state plays the role of defending, and this is just one example, defending the motherland as the male duty, reinforcing the gender roles, that the male is the protective and the woman is the helpless and needs to be taken care of. In foreign policy, which is the public sphere, Pakistan's foreign policy demonstrates a highly gendered and a hyper-masculine preoccupation with the need to fight. With religion has permeated these policies. For example, our need to fight the communist aggressor or the Hindu state. So, which justifies the Pakistan-US link. So we have always justified our connections with the United States of America because we have seen as the other, the Hindu state or the Hindu entity. So she ended with a question. Basically, she was saying that we need to find counter discourses. We need to find alternate discourses so that these discourses can be exposed and replaced. Basically, replaced. Again, she was throwing it out for discussion because she said, it's not that I know what the counter discourse is, but I just know that there is a need to develop a counter discourse. And the other question that she brought out was that we need to move out of this binary, gendered, heterosexual kind of argument, just within the parameters of the male, female, and have a multiplicity. So again, these are discourses and issues that are central to feminist conceptualizing these days, and she was bringing these out. Then Neela presented her paper, and she was looking at women as an object of fundamentalist discourse, to see the origins of stereotypes of women and where they develop, and how woman becomes the other, and the locus of desire, because woman becomes the object that is desired in the Islamic discourse. So the fear of the feminine in all patriarchal cultures, she was looking at it that on the one hand she is the desire, and on the other hand she is fear, which is why the control on her is imposed. The control comes out of the fear. So the fear of the feminine in all patriarchal cultures, because on the one hand, Islam celebrates sexuality in its discourse, but on the other hand, it lays down the parameters for how and in what way and in detail in some discourses, in some hadiths, etc. The detail how women can express their sexuality. With regard to the feminist movement, it becomes very difficult when women and their desires are interpreted by the other. It lays down the parameters for how and in what way and in detail in some discourses, in some hadiths, etc. The detail how women can express their sexuality. With regard to the feminist movement, it becomes very difficult when women and their desires are interpreted by others who are not women. Because then women become the subject and they are written, as they say, written by the other. They are written by the other, they are not expressing themselves, they are not talking about themselves. Then we had a presentation from Nafisa Shah, which she called the freedom circles of women, which is a very interesting presentation, I personally felt, where she is looking at how women's freedom expands or contracts as she moves out of the circles. And she was doing it with specific reference to sin and to the interior of sin. And this was sort of very experiential in some ways also, because she herself comes from sin. And she was also looking at herself. It was not an objective study again. I mean, none of these studies are objective studies of some reality that's out there waiting for us. These are women who were presenting them, who were locating themselves very firmly in what they were presenting. So the freedom circles, she was talking about the woman, the Haveli woman, who comes from the interior of sin, who belongs to a feudal background. I mean, this was just one of the things that she talked about. And then how her freedom circle grows as she moves from the Haveli to the big city of Karachi. And then if she were to go abroad, how that circle would move, and how she adapts herself to this movement. Every time she enters another circle, she sort of sheds another layer of herself, which can be both metaphorical and actual, shedding the chadar, for example, when you come to the city, or metaphorically freeing your mind, when you move, and then contracting your mind when you come back. So again, this is critical to an understanding of identity, because, then we are multiple people, aren't we? When we are in one setting, we are one kind of person. When we move to another setting, and this is imposed on us. This is a social control that is imposed on us because of the expectations of society, the way that society is constructed. So, the dominant discourse, the dominant ideology determines our most personal movements, our freedom, our very being, right to the point of sexuality. So, we cannot say that the state is something apart from us. The state dictates our movement at every level. How we express ourselves, who we are, is dictated to by the dominant ideology and the state. Then she looked at this concept of the tribal honor, woman as tribal honor, woman as property and object of exchange. Then the perception of women's sexuality vis-a-vis men is linked to their fertility and their ability to identify women within the fertility cycle. And that is a form of control as well, because as women grow, and this is a sort of experience not only within tribal societies, that as women grow in age and they become older, they in the eyes of the male, they lose their sexuality. So in a sense, they become ungendered, and then they get more freedom. Then you can go about without a dupatta, or you can be wearing a patla kurta, moving around, and really there is no objection to it. So she looked at dress as an identifying marker. In fact, she was looking specifically at the dress of the tribal women, of the feudal women, of some of the groups within that society. She was looking at the jewelry which was almost a form of shackles, the way their hair was dressed. And all of these are expressing forms of control over women in rural Sindh and Balochistan. Some of the questions that really were not discussed, but some of the questions that came up were, the whole definition of freedom and how do you define freedom? Whether it is in the Haveli or it is in the urban town, it overlaps, it's sort of bisecting circles. Then Sheen Faruqi presented a paper looking at the M2M movement and placing women as the female political workers who have become symbols of the political party's discourse, and including slogans, etc. But women, in a sense, have become auxiliary workers. They are relegated to fundraising and other reformist errands. And women themselves are beginning to feel this in the NQM, although so much is made about the fact that NQM has been able to mobilize hundreds and thousands of women. It's very impressive when you look at it, but actually, how much autonomy do these women have? And what are the uses to which these women have been put? And how are they used or how are they exploited? So N2M women workers are not autonomous despite their concern over only being representatives. So, basically she was saying that ethnicity can become misguided under a misguided leadership. That whereas the impulse to bring women out in itself has a positive thing, but actually when a woman, and this is a sort of a question that I think will feed into a lot of other presentations that I'm sure were made in other workshops. I think women writers also looked at it. That how do political parties use women? What is the use when women's organizations, when women's wings of political parties are not autonomous and are getting their directions from the male leadership, then what happens to the woman worker and what is the perception of what happens to her? Afia made a presentation on how Islamic laws are articulated through cultural norms. Actually, it is cultural norms which are now being codified by the state and made into Islamic laws. So the Islamic element in it, can be discussed. I mean, it's open to interpretation or discussion, but what is actually happening is that our perception of what is Islamic, the cultural perception, is being codified by the state. And she linked it to violence and how violence is institutionalized against women and reinforced by the media. And this is possible because of the state's collusion with the police, it's the police, the judicial process, and men, and their internalization of all of this. Actually, she was looking at three, it was a study of three cases: the Nawabpur case, the nurses case, and the Veena Hayat case. And she went through how, when the cases first came out, how they were represented in the media. And one of the questions that she was bringing out is that, and this is, I think, especially relevant now that we are looking at what has happened to Zainab. I mean, there were many questions that were raised, but one of the issues that was being looked at is that we always look at the perpetrators of this violence as being inhuman in some sense, as being outside the pale of humanity. And then we comfort ourselves with the thought that this person was crazy, this person was a deviant, this person was a criminal. Normal people don't do this. But actually it leads to the larger question that in a sense, society and male society is comforting itself by saying this person, this Maulvi who did it to Zainab was just a loon. He was on the lunatic fringe. But yet, the numbers of such cases means that there is a degree of violence that is being internalized, that we don't recognize, that we don't accept, and that in a sense, the violence against women will continue because we are always seeing it as something outside society, not a part of or not within our society. So the other thing is that the concept of vengeance, and we're looking at looking at how women get lost in it, looking at questions of class and questions of sex or whatever. For example, in the Veena Hayat case, the initial headlines were talking about Veena Hayat, but then suddenly it became a question of Shaukat Hayat's honor. And the whole question of vengeance and the tribal, the tribesmen coming out and seeking vengeance if the government will not, if the government will not do anything about it, then the tribesmen will avenge the honor. But whose honor? It was the male honor. So somewhere Veena Hayat got lost in Shaukat Hayat. That was at the sexual level. At the level of class, at the same time that Veena Hayat's case came out, and it was a question of political violence, at the same time the Khurshid Begum case came out. And the Khurshid Begum case got lost in the Veena Hayat case. Although I know that women's organizations here did make an effort, and Khurshid Begum even came to Lahore and spoke from a platform and things. But actually what was happening is both were victims of political violence. Political violence was being played out. They were objectified and the violence was played out in their bodies. But Veena Hayat was picked up, Khurshid Begum was submerged. So these were some of the issues that we looked at. As I said, there were many other issues that we looked at. Then Bunny and Anis made a presentation of their partition project. Now, they are looking at the effects of partition on the women. Because again, much has been written about partition. But the impact of partition on the women there's a total silence on this issue. So they are looking at it. There is mention of it in literature, which is what Anis is looking at it. But actually, the sort of hundreds and thousands of books that have come up on the Muslim League and the Congress and Jinnah and Gandhi and X and Y, there has, in that sense, been no study of what happened. Now, this started out as a 3-nation project. It was going to be women from India and Bangladesh and Pakistan. The Bangladesh women, very interesting. Again, Bunny and Anis made a very interesting presentation because they were locating themselves within the study, since their roots also are from across the border or across the divide or whatever it is. So they were locating themselves in the study. And interestingly, they reported that the Bangladeshi women, after the trauma of 71, when they went to research it, they just felt that they could not continue with the study because it was too painful. Going back to the women refugees and talking to them was just something that they did not want to do. Initially, as I say, the India and Pakistan study were to continue as one study, but then it separated into 2 studies. And again, locating themselves within it, they said that part of the reason for that was that whatever the politics of the division at that time, suddenly the perspectives were different. The Indian women were looking at it from one perspective, and they had one set of concerns, and the Pakistani women had separate concerns. So the 2 studies are coming out, but they're not coming out as a single study. So this was a study on how women dealt with and continue to deal with the trauma and violence of partition. And this is a history from within, not a history from outside, what happened to the women. These are women's voices. These are women telling you what happened to them. And in a sense, these are women who had no part in the decision to come to Pakistan or to stay behind. These were decisions that were taken by the male in the household. And yet the uprooting was also the uprooting of the woman. And in many cases, the uprooting of the woman from the parental home, from her parental links. And then some very interesting observations were made linking it to the politics of the MQM. That, when a people are dislocated and when a people are uprooted, and if they feel threatened again, what is the psyche that develops? What's the thinking? What's the psychology that develops? The fear of displacement again, and the fear of violence again. Again, this whole question of violence, these strands are going through all the presentations. The question of violence, we all know the degree of violence at partition, the horrors of violence that were perpetrated against women. But we haven't looked at the violence that the women did to themselves, like committing suicide. The number of women who jumped into wells because they internalized the male concept of honor. Because their honor became linked. So in many cases, the men killed the women of the family. In many cases, the women themselves, jumped into wells or killed themselves or committed suicide or whatever. In fact, there's a very interesting film which comes to mind, Division of Hearts, which has been made on what happened during partition. Now, the absence of women from official recorded history is also there. And, the whole concept of identity, what is home or watan? It was identified not as a geographical but as an emotional space. And creating a split in the identity. You come to Pakistan, but you're carrying one identity with you. And now you're in another land and you're acquiring another identity, so you know what happens to that split in your identity. And the identity is often created by the other, whether in partition or in today's ethnic conflicts. Even political groups are sometimes organized and constructed against or to counter each other. So it's a question of looking at women's identity and male honor. Another interesting thing that Elise and Bani brought up were the question of the heroic. For example, we have the heroes of the 65 war and we have the heroes of the 71 war, but there are no heroes in the conflict of 47. And she says, when we went to investigate, we would have thought that, you're coming towards a dream, you're making a homeland, so, you say कि मैंने इतने सिख मारे या इतने हिंदू मारे और मैं इतना ज़बरदस्त. But there is an absolute silence there. And they are arguing that this is a silence because this was an internecine war. It was brother or sister, however you look at it, it was a human, these were communities that were divided. Nobody is going to brag about the fact of how they killed their next door neighbor. So, and also this, in a sense, everybody says there was a lot of violence, but nobody is willing to admit to the violence. Nobody says, I did it, or my uncle did it. Everybody says, जी, उधर हुआ था, उन्होंने किया था, although सबने किया था. Magar, it's a sort of a horror of the violence at one end. So, these were some of the things that Bani and Anis presented. Anis then did a presentation also on looking at women's experience of partition through literary texts. And then she went through a whole range of literature. I don't have all the names here, but she looked at Ismail Chugtai, and she looked at Krishan Chandra, and she looked at Parvan Singh, and she looked at a whole range, and Manto, of course, who's dealt with it very sensitively, of all the male writers. So again, looking at the interesting thing is that really not too many Pakistani writers have written about it. There's Khadija Mastoor who's written about it. But not too many Pakistani writers have brought up the experience. It's a kind of a self-censorship and control, in a sense, that has happened. So she presented an outline of that and the horror of it, and how the other is created, and how what a displaced woman goes through. There are beautiful stories actually. One can start telling you the stories, and it's just fascinating. I'm sure a lot of you have read them. But that was the other dimension of the study that was presented. Then I did a textual analysis of women's identity through a very recent, a 1994 publication of Zahida Hina's story, Na Janoo Raha Na Pari Rahi. And interestingly enough, it linked with what Anis had been talking about, because 50 years or however many years, 48 years after partition, the effects of it are still reverberating in our literature. And the trauma of it has not been resolved. So the lingering effects of the impact of partition, they resonate in the novel. And it's asking questions like whether it is possible to completely evolve any identity if one is cut off from one's roots and heritage. And if such an identity does evolve, can it be anything more than a crude, materialistic, and crass identity? Yes, and can nations evolve an identity if they continue to deny their heritage? And if we turn our back on history, and if we refuse to acknowledge all the different strands that constitute our identity, then we will always be searching. This business of 48 years after the partition of the country, we are still asking ourselves the question, what is the ideology of Pakistan? It's so fragile, it's so threatened, we feel so vulnerable, we are constantly on the defensive about ourselves. Somewhere there is a resolution that is not taking place, that is not happening, and women writers, certainly Samina in this, is being very sensitive about it, and she's questioning and asking. Actually, she's bringing in a whole other discourse also, because it's dealing with the Parsi community and the values of the Parsi community, the Kawastis, and the values of humanity and gentleness and culture, that they infuse into it. And the link, the way that we have marginalized certain sections of our society, the way that we do not acknowledge all the different strands that make up our identity. So these were some of the questions that mine was a sort of a textual analysis of the deconstruction of the text through the language, through the imagery, and the questions that emerge from it.